Our next speaker is Robert Rollinger. Should be no stranger to all of you. Professor of Ancient History and Ancient Near Eastern Studies at the University of Innsbruck in Austria, where he has been chair since 2005 in the Department of Ancient History and Ancient Near Eastern Studies. His scholarly interests are wide-ranging and encompass the cultural expanse between the Aegean world and the ancient Near East, with a special focus on ancient historiography and comparative history of empires, and the Achaemenid Empire in particular. He is a member of numerous academic organizations and research groups, among them the Austrian Academy of Sciences, the German Archaeological Institute, and the Academia Europaea. Robert Rollinger will be speaking on the Achaemenid Persian Empire and the West, a structural approach. Okay.
Of course, I also have to start with being grateful to the organizers of this conference, Raim and Jeffrey, and to the UCLA, of course, and the Getty for having this wonderful, wonderful conference. So let me start. In summer 430 BCE, a terrible plague ravaged Athens. The overcrowded city was under siege by the Spartans and faced terrible death rates by a disease nobody appears to have known before. Thucydides left a famous description of the plague and its devastating effects. Already its beginning is impressive, and I'm just reading out the bold text. Not many days after their arrival in Africa, the plague, nosos, first began to show itself among the Athenians. It was said that it had broken out in many places previously in the neighborhood of Lemnos and elsewhere, but a pestilence, loimos, of such extent and mortality was nowhere remembered. End of quote. Modern literature about the plague in Athens during the second year of the Peloponnesian War is vast, as many of you know. However, it nearly exclusively revolves around two aspects only: the nature of the plague and Thucydides' masterly descriptions of the symptoms, together with a reception history of its treatment. Astonishingly, recent scholarship neither discusses nor takes into account a possible larger framework of the pestilence. This Hellenocentric narrowing of the perspective is even more remarkable since Thucydides himself contextualizes the disease and refers to other places of origin. He mentions not only the Isle of Lemnos, and thus the northern Aegean, as we have just seen in the passage quoted above, but Thucydides provides even further details. I quote again: "It first began, it is said, in the parts of Ethiopia above Egypt, and thence descended into Egypt and Libya, and into most of the king's country. Suddenly falling upon Athens, it first attacked the population of Piraeus, which was the occasion of their saying that the Peloponnesians had poisoned the reservoirs, there being as yet no wells there, and afterwards appeared in the upper city, when the deaths became much more frequent." Thucydides clearly states that the disease first moved into the king's country, Esten Basileusgen, and from there to Athens via the Piraeus. What we have here is an obvious observation about the spread of a pandemic in the eastern Mediterranean. It is of lesser importance whether the disease really originated in Ethiopia above Egypt, or whether people just thought it did. What matters is the fact that the disease blazed its trail from the Achaemenid Empire, the king's country, to the Aegean and Athens. It is not by chance that it did so via the port of Piraeus, since any pandemic requires connectivity and entanglement. Pathogens travel along paths that have moved human populations, and dynamic human movement is equivalent to disease dispersal, as all of us know. Thus, what Thucydides' testimonial exhibits, beyond its exquisite literary presentation, is a proto-globalized world, with the Achaemenid Persian Empire as a major player and intensive communication networks across the imperial borderlands towards the outside world. It is these borderlands, their dynamic entanglement with the empire, and their structural disposition that deserves our attention. These areas exhibit some characteristic features that they share due to their specific position at the rims of the empire. Seen from the center and due to imperial ideology, they are peripheral zones, but nevertheless under firm control of the great king. However, seen from a structural point of view, they are not peripheral at all, but represent a category of their own with their very specific dynamics caught between forces of attraction and repulsion. They maintain close ties with the imperial center, but also with the outside world. They are part of the empire, but at the same time deeply connected with the world beyond the empire's direct reach. They define an area of communication between inside and outside, linked and joined this side and the other side. This intermediate position offers a wide range of possibilities, but carries also risk and danger. This is especially true for the main historical agents, that is, the local elites. Contact with the imperial administration and economy opens up a new world that triggers internal developments and changes local power structures. The empire can be viewed as a focal point of admiration and emulation, but also as a place of disgust and antithesis. New modes of legitimization become available, and trans-regional consciousness of identities are fostered and boosted. This ambiguity also applies to the imperial center. Expansion towards the periphery follows the imperial agenda and means the enlargement of power and influence. At the same time, imperial overstretch becomes the more relevant the deeper the empire expands into areas beyond. Moreover, imperial expansion not only triggers local conflicts, but transfers inter-peripheral struggles into an imperial agenda. Local agents have to choose whether they foster their careers and ambitions by imperial backing or whether they take an opposite stance. These dynamics can be seen in nearly all border areas, the better as well as the less well-documented ones. The Greek world of Western Asia Minor and the Aegean offers very good examples for these dynamics. Although our mainly Greek sources develop and propagate a different picture that revolves around the dichotomy between East and West, Greeks and barbarians, freedom and despotism, a closer look reveals that such a biased perspective does not do justice to the historical circumstances. It is rather the result of a development in the long term which only created a Greek identity that was politically used and instrumentalized from a certain period onwards when Athens became a dominating force in the Aegean. So let us have a look at the West under these perspectives. When Cyrus the Great submitted Croesus and the kingdom of Lydia in the 40s of the 6th century BCE, the Persians not only became masters of Western Asia Minor, but also of various Greek poleis of Ionia on the coast of the Aegean. These city-states were already vassals of the Lydian king and now received a new overlord. The Persians did not considerably change the administrative structure of this region. They installed a governor in Sardis, but the Greek city-states at the very western rim of the empire continued to be ruled indirectly. As long as the local agents respected Persian rule, paid tribute, and added soldiers and ships to the imperial forces whenever needed, everything was fine. As far as the internal government of these poleis is concerned, the empire was flexible enough to accept aristocratic as well as democratic rule. Important was loyalty only. However, political situations within the Greek poleis were generally unstable, and opposing factions in each city were eagerly seeking for Persian support. The empire, voluntarily or involuntarily, became more and more involved in these conflicts and had to settle situations of unrest and turmoil. Successful local agents from outside, and in retrospective often discredited as tyrants, were prone to imperial favors. Their successless opponents watched out for further assistance in areas beyond, thus continuously involving polities further afield into imperial agendas. Successful players faced undreamed of possibilities, which however were short-lived due to the ever-changing dynamics in these border areas. Polycrates of Samos is a memorable example of such a career that led from a master of the sea by a newly established naval fleet with far-reaching contacts to his final execution by the Persian governor of Sardis. One of his successors, Syloson, actively sought for Persian assistance to finally successfully gain control of Samos. Histiaeus of Miletus and his son-in-law Aristagoras were similarly dazzling figures. Both were rewarded and punished by the Greek king for their politics. Aristagoras' unfortunate campaign against the Isle of Naxos led to the loss of the great king's favor. Finally, he took the bull by the horns and organized an anti-Persian alliance that ended up in the Ionian Revolt. At the end, the empire succeeded in perseverance and the revolt was crushed. This was a consequent reaction, but also a long-lasting war. Although later Greek tradition presented the revolt as a struggle for Greek liberty, this was an anachronistic view. If this were true, the imperial crisis at the beginning of Darius' reign would have offered much better opportunities. What we face is much more due to the complicated ups and downs of border zone dynamics than to ideological concepts of an alleged nationally driven longing for freedom. This is rather a later invention. The situation became even more complicated since the empire was still in a period of further expansion. At the end of the 6th century BCE, Darius and his generals further pushed forward into European territories beyond the Hellespont. Although they first concentrated on an advance along the coast, controlling the major ports along the northern Aegean and the Black Sea, inland polities like the Odrysian kingdom Thrace in the middle Hebros Valley and Macedonia soon became Persian vassals. This is also true to Athens, at least in the eyes of the great king, who interpreted the delivery of gifts at the end of the 6th century BC as an act of submission, which implied to share the great king's friends and opponents. A campaign by Mardonius in 492 secured the Persian positions in the northern Aegean. Another campaign 2 years later by Tatis and Artaphernes later further pushed toward Persian influence into the Aegean by sacking Eretria. However, a landing operation at Attica ended up in the Battle of Marathon that led to a retreat of the Persian forces. Whether this landing was an attempt of invasion, which was definitely pushed back in a decisive battle, as it became part of Athenian memory and propaganda, or a simple raid that ended up in a skirmish and hasty embarking, is a matter of debate. At least the operation exemplified the far reach of Persian forces beyond the Aegean and the willingness of the great king to further expand his influence and to settle political obstruction in the regions beyond that also affected the border areas of his empire. The climax of this engagement, of course, is Xerxes' campaign 10 years later in 480-479. This confrontation was not one between the Greeks and the Persians, but one between the empire and a Hellenic league of about 30 poleis under the leadership of Sparta. As part of the empire's army fought Greeks from all over Western Asia and the northern Aegean, including Thessalians and Boeotians. Although we are not sure about the empire's ultimate goals, a provincialization of the Greek world was definitely beyond the great king's aspiration. Western Asia and the northern Aegean were controlled via vassals, and there is no reason to believe that this should have been different with the region further to the southwest. However, as we have seen, these regions were heavily involved in all kinds of affairs of the empire's outer rim. This involvement initiated discrete processes and independent developments that could not really be controlled anymore, neither by the empire nor by the agents along the rim and beyond. Such a loss of control was interpreted by the empire as disloyalty, a constant source of unrest, provocation, and disrespect that required imperial action and chastisement. From a certain point of view, one can define the great king's politics as to find a long-term solution for the Greek problem, as Misha Meyer put it recently. But one could also argue that with the conquest of Athens and the great king's sacrifice on the Acropolis, major goals of the campaign may have been regarded as achieved. However, the campaign further triggered processes of their own, that were certainly neither intended by the great king nor by the victors when the war had started. The empire faced considerable setbacks by its land and sea forces, Salamis, Plataea, and with the Delian League, a forceful and trans-regional opponent had been established that challenged Persian power in the west more than Darius and Xerxes might have ever imagined before 480 BC. At the same time, the grand design of the campaign, impressive as it was, revealed an imperial overstretch that unmistakably demonstrated that the empire had already achieved a maximum of expansion. We can interpret this turning point of Achaemenid imperial history either as a sign of exhaustion or as a begin of a phase of consolidation of more than 150 further years. The dynamics at the border areas, however, did not end up but increased. For about 30 years, the Delian League, which actually masked a more and more forced Athenian hegemony that actually owed its existence to the dynamics of the Persian Empire's western border region, created considerable unrest and losses for the great king. Yet, very soon, also Athens faced terrible setbacks and overstretch. Operations beyond the Aegean had only limited success, interventions in Egypt ended in disaster, and an attempt to intervene in Cyprus also failed. Moreover, Athenian politics evoked more and more opposition within the Greek world, ending up in the Peloponnesian War at the end of the century. It was this war when the great king successfully returned as a major agent at the western border regions of his empire. Sparta only prevailed in this war due to the empire's lavish subsidies. There was no inner conflict in the 4th century, inner Greek conflict in the 4th century, in which the great king was not actively involved. With the Peace of Antalcidas, 387, he, the great king, actually not only regained direct control over all Greek poleis of Western Asia Minor, but also supremacy over the Aegean. The ultimate enemy of the Greek city-states was not the great king, but other city-states, with similar aspirations for trans-regional influence and power. Popular slogans like autonomy and liberty were primarily not directed against the empire with the intention to free the Greek city-states of Western Asia Minor, but towards Greek competitors in an ongoing struggle for power and influence. Before Philip II of Macedon, there was no power in the Aegean who was able to match the great king and his empire. The situation changed with the ascendancy of Macedonia, a relatively new kingdom at the empire's border region that, as Athens and Sparta before, owed its special position and strength to its localization immediately beyond the empire's rim. When Alexander III, Philip's son and successor, started his campaign against the empire, he triggered a long-standing and hard war that clearly showed that the empire was neither weak nor in decline. Although there is a vivid debate in modern scholarship whether Alexander can be regarded as last Achaemenid or not, it can only hardly be doubted that Macedonian Alexander considerably owed rise and success to their initial position at an imperial borderland, as Anshan and Cyrus did more than 200 years earlier. It is true that from the 6th through the 4th century, the Aegean exhibited the dynamics of an imperial borderland in a very special way, but comparable processes can be observed in other regions as well. Cyprus offers an example for similar developments. The island harbored several independent city-states with a mixed population of Greek and Phoenician vernaculars. These city-states became vassals of the Neo-Assyrian Empire since the 7th century BCE, although there were neither a Neo-Assyrian governor nor Neo-Assyrian troops on the island. After the downfall of the Neo-Assyrian Empire, the city-states faced competing alliances and supremacies when the Scythe kingdom of Egypt and the Neo-Babylonian Empire were vying for influence and domination in the eastern Mediterranean. With Cambyses' preparations for a campaign against Egypt, the Persians started to establish a navy as first ancient Near Eastern empire. During this time, the Persian grip on the Phoenician city-states at the Levant became stronger, for it was these vassals whose know-how and capacities were key for the Persians' ambitions to control the sea as well as the land. Whether the city-states of Cyprus became Persian vassals before or after the conquest of Egypt is difficult to say. In any case, the Persian control of the islands followed the paths already established in the 7th century BC. The connections of the island with the Levant, Cilicia, and Egypt were as intensive as its networks towards the west. Thus, the integration of the Cypriot city-states into the Persian Empire was a logical step, as the empire was still expanding and safeguarding its position in the eastern Mediterranean. Although Persian control of the island was somehow similar to its Neo-Assyrian predecessor, the empire's grip became nevertheless tighter. As far as we know, there was never a governor on the island, and the city lords continued to rule their territories as vassals of the great king. However, the adjacent Persian satraps of Syria and Cilicia regularly intervened when necessary and sent troops on the island when there was political unrest. The city-states considerably enlarged the Persian naval capacities and were important for the empire's naval operations in the Aegean from the Persian Wars onwards. The close ties to the Aegean world also involved some Cypriot city-states in the Ionian Revolt, but the empire very soon regained control of the island. The situation became more difficult when Xerxes' campaign failed in 479 and the Delian League started to operate beyond the Aegean. However, also in this case, Athens' ambitions to gain foothold on the island terribly failed in the middle of the 5th century BC. A special challenge was the rise and the ambitions of the ambitious city lord of Salamis, Euagoras I, in the second half of the 5th century BC. the manifold political maneuvers of this warlord, who declared himself as king of Salamis, exemplified once more Cyprus' position in an imperial borderland as a western outpost of the empire on the one hand, but with strong ties towards the outer world on the other hand. His policies of expansion on the island at the expense of other city-states such as Kition, Amathus, and Solai led to various interventions at the court of the great king Artaxerxes II. On the one side, Agoras was eager to get assistance from allies in the Aegeans, especially Athens, and Egypt, the usurper pharaohs Achoris. On the other side, he knew how to outplay different opposite fractions within the empire and to enlarge his position on the island for a certain time, as he even managed to extend his range of control as far as the Levant. The turmoil related to this unrest was even noticed by the itinerant South Arabian merchant Subhumu, who led a caravan north to Dedan, modern Ul-Ala, via Gaza, to the towns of Judah, which is reported in one of his inscriptions. In the end, Persian troops under the command of the satraps Autophrodates of Lydia and Hekatomnos of Caria conquered Salamis and disciplined Euagoras. However, he was not deposed, but his power just restricted, and his position reduced to that of a peer to the other Cypriot city lords, all of them respecting the great king's sovereignty. The tight connection between Cyprus, Phoenicia, and Egypt became once more evident when Sidon revolted in the 40s of the 4th century BC and was joined by several Cypriot city lords. Both parties obviously were in contact with the Egyptian usurper Nectanebo. The reaction of the great king was harsh and ended with total defeat of the Sidonians and the Cypriot rebels. Artaxerxes III successfully reorganized his power base in the Levant, from where he reconquered Egypt some years later. As a consequence, he also seems to have installed Euagoras II, grandson of Euagoras I, as city lord of Sidon. A silver obol from Cyprus shows this king with a Persian tiara when he had been city lord of Salamis. Neither in Phoenicia nor in Cyprus the empire was challenged again. It was only when Alexander III had gained a firm grip on the Levant in 332 that the Cypriot polities left the empire. So let's draw a conclusion. The Achaemenid Persians set up a novel concept of empire that was self-contained and universalistic at the very same time. They developed a mental map, the ingredients of which was a concept of an enumeration of lands, you can see an example just on the screen, which was not by chance created, tested, and checked out, changed and adapted during the reigns of Darius and Xerxes, when the new dynasty was eager to achieve legitimacy and push the empire's borders to its maximum extent. The concept was self-contained, especially from an outside perspective, since it defined an imperial space that pretended to represent the world, but evidently did not meet this claim. This is especially the view developed at the best documented border zone, that is the Greek world, where, since the days of Hecataeus, geographical worldviews were concocted that were heavily indebted to the Achaemenid template, but went beyond, also with a critical note, and had a rather different setting and Sitz im Leben. It was universalistic from an official inside perspective, since again it professed to constitute the world, but this time less evidently did not reflect reality. When the great king referred to his subjects, to his Greek subjects, and you can see examples here, in their various subcategories, he absolutely might have included the entire Greek world in his claim, be it true or not. The same applies, by the way, for the eastern border to the Saka, who covered the vast territories of the north and the east. The dynamics between these two concepts refers to imperial border zones that developed within the tensions of these two competing concepts, contradictory only at first glance. This tension not only arose from different perspectives and claims, but also by the very specific constituents, socially, economically, and politically, of these border areas. They belonged to different worlds at the very same time. They were part of the empire, but also components of an outer world. This special situation was a hotbed of peculiar developments, of adaptations and adoptions, but also of delimitation and alienation, of identity shaping and binary worldviews. The empire's reach to an outside world far beyond the great king's direct control was the essential trigger and ingredient for these dynamic developments. Contact and transfer were intense through all the time of the empire's existence, pushing forward integration as well as disintegration. It is not by chance that it was the Achaemenid Empire that offers one of the very first examples of an idea of the world as being diverse and variegated. This concept of diversity was consciously propagated in the royal inscriptions as an official vision of the world. It was not inserted into a dichotomized worldview of we and they, inside and outside, but equated with the world as such, that is, a diversified world ruled by the great king. Forerunners of such a concept have been already developed in the Neo-Assyrian Empire, but a close look reveals them to be different. There is ample evidence that the Neo-Assyrians renamed conquered places and land, juxtaposing old and new designations. In a famous passage, you can see it on the screen, of a Neo-Assyrian royal inscription, when the Neo-Assyrian king Esarhaddon summarizes his campaign against Egypt, the text starts in the following way. I quote, you can see it: "In my 10th campaign, the god Ashur had me made me set out to Magan and Melucha, which are called Cush and Egypt in their native tongue." End of quote. It is true the world is consciously presented as diversified, but only as long as it is out of the reach of Ashur, his king and his armies. As soon as it is conquered, it is renamed and thus harmonized. This is entirely different in Achaemenid times. Already the fact that of trilingual royal inscriptions, extended by a fourth language with hieroglyphic texts of Egypt, exhibits a novel conception of the world. This world is not harmonized but diverse, also after the great king has taken control. Moreover, diversity is not a flaw but distinction, as the plenty references to this kind of qualification in the royal inscriptions demonstrate. The great king rules lands, Barusana, as you can see, containing many kinds of men. He is ruler of lands containing all kinds of men, Vispasana. Jan Tavernier notes, I quote, "The words were firmly established in the Achaemenid royal ideology and were that specific that the Elamite and once a Babylonian version simply transcribed the old Persian words into their own languages." End of quote. However, the Babylonian versions were also free to develop their own translations of this Achaemenid concept, when Barusana and Vispasana became Shanapcha Lishanu or Shanapcha Lishanata of all tongues. And you see the examples on the screen. The fact that the trilingual inscriptions do not harmonize ethnic designations, but openly present different worldviews further highlights this concept. Whereas the Old Persian and Elamite versions talk about Saka, Saka, Armina, Harminu, and Maka, the Babylonian versions have Gimiri, Cimmerians, Urashtu, Urartu, and Kadu. As the reliefs of the throne bearers and delegations, as well as the depictions of the famous statue of Darius from Susa exhibit, diversity was not only related to language, but also to attire, weapons, and what we would call culture. This conscious acknowledgement and celebration of diversity as such, but also of diverse views of the world, can be taken as a sign of deep and thorough consideration of human affairs and thus of enlightenment. It is not by chance that Greek Enlightenment, what we call Greek Enlightenment of the 6th century BCE, did not start in Greece, but in the Achaemenid Empire, at its outer western limits, close to the border zone. If we leave modern concepts of nation and identity, as well as modern ethnic designations aside, this intellectual revolution was as Persian as Greek. Actually, it was none of both, but Achaemenid imperial, set up at one of the major channels interconnecting the empire with the outside world. Thank you for your attention.